War, famine, immigration, lack of work, and little food brought on the uprising of thousands of people. On June 30th, 1966, in 16 major cities across the United States, thousands of people marched to demand economic and civil rights for poor Americans, marking the beginning of a nationwide welfare rights movement. The National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO, its central institution, demanded decent jobs with adequate wages and adequate income for those who could not work. The welfare rights movement grew out of the struggles in major cities across the U.S. By the early 1960s, a dedicated group of civil rights and poverty activists formed citywide, which coordinated welfare activism in New York, Los Angeles, California, in Los Angeles, California, a group of mothers living in the projects in Compton came together as ANC, which was the Aid to Needy Children. To challenge the dehumanizing aspects of the welfare system. These women were single mothers, raising multiple young children while trying to get by on small monthly welfare payments. Tired of harsh, condescending treatment they received at the welfare office, they often felt they were seen as criminals. In addition to the poor treatment from social workers, they were treated by lawmakers, politicians, and the media as a burden on taxpayers and were marked as cheating and were just too lazy to work. Women came together to start protesting at local welfare offices. They demanded better treatment, guidance in navigating the welfare bureaucracy, and an increase in payments in order to achieve a decent standard of living for their children. The Poor People's Campaign marked an important transition in the U.S. history. This drew attention on poverty, and as a multi-ethnic crusade, the voices of Americans' poor were finally heard. In 1967, Reverend Martin Luther King announced the plan to bring together poor people from across the country for a new march on Washington. This march was to demand better jobs, better homes, better education, better lives than the one that they were living. Dr. King saw that poverty was not just another issue and that poor people were not a special interest group. He described the unjust economic conditions facing millions of people worldwide and how the people needed to come together and transform the whole of society. The poor would have to organize to take action together around immediate basic needs, becoming a powerful social and political force. First step in building the power was needed to achieve the goal of a radical redistribution of political and economic power. King, along with other leaders, of the poor, such as Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO, helped work out the major elements of the platform of the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. An important aspect of the campaign was to petition the government to pass an economic Bill of Rights as a step to lift the load off poverty. The National Welfare Rights Organization evolved from several different advocacy efforts in the 1960s. One was the Organization of Welfare Recipients in the Watts section of LA in 1963 by Miss Johnny Tillman. Second, a strategy outlined in the 1966 article, I'm on the wrong slide, I'm sorry, The Nation by two Columbia University professors of social work, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward. The third influence was the decision of Dr. George Wiley, a civil rights activist, to join forces and support a group of activists who planned on a 155-mile march by welfare recipients and supporters. It would start in Cleveland, Ohio, and arriving in the state capitol. With the assistance of representatives from the civil rights groups, labor organizations, church, and social work groups, NWRO became the national voice of welfare clients' rights. They created a petition to the government to pass the Economic Bill of Rights as a step to lift the load of poverty. $30 billion annual appropriated for a real war on poverty. The congressional passage of full employment and guaranteed income legislation, which means a guaranteed annual wage, construction of 500,000 low-cost housing units per year until the slums were eliminated. The efforts of the poor people organized by King and other leaders, climaxed in the Solidarity Day rally for jobs, peace, and freedom on June 19, 1968. $50,000 people joined 3,000 participants living at Resurrection City to rally around the demands of the Poor People's Campaign in Solidarity Day. This was the first and only massive mobilization to take place in this time. Poor People's Campaign brought attention to hunger, A few months after the Resurrection City closed, food programs were launched in 1,000 neediest cities as identified the campaign objective. A supplementary food program for mothers and children. And here's the other slide. For mothers and children was launched. And also, by the end of the year, additionally, Congress approved $243 million to expand and revamp school lunches to help feed hungry children. Congress extended existing labor programs, and the Senate approved an additional $5 million for Head Start, $13 million for summer jobs, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare targeted a fall of 1969 deadline to eliminate all segregated school systems. Congress also approved $139 million for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Education and Welfare Services. Government approved rent subsidies and home ownership assistance for the poor. By the 1970s, their efforts created the National Welfare Rights Movement. National Welfare Rights Movement, which included a major organization, the National Welfare Rights Organization, active from 1966 to 1975. Primary goals was adequate income, dignity, justice, and democratic participation of people on welfare and their children. various points in time, welfare rights movements intersected with civil rights movements, black power, and women's movements, along with the war on poverty programs created by the federal government and the Poor People's Movement. By the 1980s, however, many of the hard-fought gains won by families in the 60s and 70s were rolled back as the social, political, and economic conditions shifted, leading to benefits being cut and the reassertion of rhetoric demonizing people on welfare. Today, as income inequality is at its most extreme in U.S. history, families on welfare continue to face many of the same challenges as they did in the 60s. The Poor People's Campaign introduced new strategies for protest and social change. The movement also helped transform national discussions on race, class, and economic opportunities, security, and democracy. The year 1968 represented the transformative period in American history as civil rights movement began addressing human rights issues across boundaries nationwide. I chose this movement because I choose to identify with the underprivileged. I feel as a social worker it is my job and my duty to care for people. I choose to identify with the poor. I choose to give my life for the hungry. I choose to give my life for those who've been left out. This is the way I'm going. I am a helper. I am a social worker. Thanks for listening.